All right, running meetings like a pro. Here's what we'll cover. We'll talk for a little bit about types of meetings, the notice requirements, what quorum means, talk for a little bit about meeting minutes. And one of my favorites quotes is, they're meeting minutes, not meeting hours. Yeah. And I'll explain what that means when we get to that point. And then actually the last about 10 minutes, we will do sort of a fictitious meeting with some motions and that sort of thing. And then we'll have a Q&A. Now, I've been giving this caveat, which is your governing documents may say very different things than some of the things I say tonight. And I'll give you an example. Some of you are in Washington, some of you are in Oregon. And often the statute that governs you, they have a lot of what I call default provisions. So in other words, if your governing documents are silent, if you're an Oregon condominium, with respect to your quorum requirement for an owner's meeting, then the statute says it's 20%. So often when I talk about quorum, I will say 20%, and inevitably one of you will say, well, my quorum is 30 or 40%. And I know that, and I get that, and I know your governing documents will very often say different things. Let's start off with some math. Bruce allegedly, when he was in high school, was on the Maryland State math team. I have yet to see any evidence of this. But let's do this. Here's our hypothetical. There's 200 lots in the HOA, and a meeting of the owners has been called, and 100 of the 200 show up. And whatever the issue is that's to be voted on, 97 of the 100 are there, vote yes, and 3 abstain, okay? Now, these next 3 bullet points, it's language that you will see in your bylaws, and they mean very different things, even though they look very similar, okay? So let's take this first one. Suppose whatever it is you're voting on as an association, the language in your bylaws, says that in order to pass, a majority of owners present in person or proxy at a meeting. How many votes are needed?
100.
Everyone agree?
I do not agree.
You don't, huh, Bruce? What do you think it is?
101.
Let's see, a majority of owners present. How many owners are present?
100.
100. So majority of
20%
100
of 200.
is 51.
And we're going to assume quorum has been achieved, okay? This would be 51. Okay.
Yeah.
Everyone on board? Bruce, you agree?
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's go to this next one. Let's say your bylaws say that in order for whatever it is you're voting on to be approved, that it requires a majority of votes cast by owners present in person or proxy.
This is an interesting question,
It is.
because you could say it's 49 votes are needed because that's majority, only 97 were cast, votes were cast. But is there an argument that abstention is the casting of a vote?
Under Robert's rules, no. Abstention does not count toward the vote totals. So yeah, it'd be a majority of 97, which is what, Bruce?
49.
Yeah. Now let's go look at the last one. Let's say whatever it is you're voting on requires the approval of a majority of all lot owners. What's that take?
101.
101.
101, and you're not going to get it because there's only 100 present. So my point in this is a lot of your documents will have language like this, and be very, very careful and cautious when reading it to make sure you understand what the voting threshold is. Now, in most community associations, there are several types of meetings: annual meetings, special meetings, board meetings, committee meetings, architectural review committee meetings. Now, the first two, annual and special, that always implies that the assembly, the individuals entitled to participate and vote, are the owners, okay, all lot owners. Now, board meetings, the assembly, those entitled to participate and vote, the assembly are board members. And where things get a little confusing is most of you are subject to open meetings requirements. So if you have a board meeting, you have to provide notice to the owners, and the owners are entitled to attend and listen and observe the board's deliberation and discussion. But technically, they have no right to speak or participate unless you have something in your bylaws that says otherwise. Now, generally speaking, we always recommend it's a good idea to have an open forum either at the beginning or the end of the meeting so that owners can voice concerns. And I always tell chairs, you know, use your discretion in the middle of a board meeting, depending on the topic. If you've got an owner with a special set of expertise related to the issue you're discussing, maybe it makes sense to let them pipe up and voice their concerns or their opinions or recommendations. Now, committee meetings generally are not open to owners unless there happens to be a quorum of the board also on the committee. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Now, why does it matter? It matters, the type of meeting matters because the notice requirements are going to be different. Whether it's open to the membership depends on the type of meeting. The quorum requirement is going to be different. And who gets to vote and participate, the assembly, as Robert's Rules of Order calls it, is also different, okay? Now, for notice, again, it depends on what type of community and which state you're in, but a lot of board meetings, your governing documents and the statute requires at least 3 days advance notice of any board meeting. And then the question is, what constitutes a board meeting? And I'll have Bruce address that in just a moment. For annual meetings, again, it's going to depend largely on your governing documents, but often you'll see that notice for annual meetings must be sent no less than 10 days and no more than 50 days in advance of the meeting. So again, it's going to largely depend on your governing documents. If your governing documents are silent, then the statute does have defaults on those notice requirements. Now, you've heard me mention this concept of assembly, and that's what Robert's Rules refers to as the individuals entitled to participate and vote. So if we go back to the types of meetings, the assembly at an annual meeting or a special meeting, that's all owners. And board members who were attending, you're really there in your capacity as an owner, not as a board member at an annual meeting. Now, for board meetings, the assembly is the board. So only the board is authorized and entitled to vote and participate and speak. All right. Here's one for you. And I hear this all the time, which is the chair of the association can only vote in the event of a tie. Has anyone ever heard that? A lot of you, yeah, a lot of you have.
Yes.
And yeah, and let me explain why that most likely does not apply to you. So that Robert's Rules does say that. It says that in the event of a tie among a board, the chairperson votes to break that tie. But that only applies to situations where the chairperson is not also a board member. And in almost every one of your communities, the chair or the president is also a board member. So one of the things that we deal with often is the confusion between directors and officers. And generally the way it works is owners elect directors, directors elect officers. And by officers, I mean generally president or chair, vice chair, secretary, treasurer. Those are the general officer positions. And what that means is the board, a majority vote of the board can elect officers or remove an officer. But to remove a director almost always requires a special meeting of the owners and an affirmative vote of the owners to remove a director. But assuming that you are the chair and you are also a board member, then your duty is actually to vote, not just to vote in the event of a tie. You're supposed to be voting in your capacity as a director. Does that make sense, hopefully? All right, Bruce, I'll turn it over to you for a moment to talk about what constitutes a board meeting, which would then trigger the obligation to provide notice and allowing the owners to observe and listen.
Board meeting is any time that a quorum of directors convenes to discuss association business.
So let me ask you this, Bruce. Let's say me, you, and Deneen are a 3-person board. A quorum would be 2 of us in most cases.
Most cases, it's possible that the bylaws might define a different quorum, but absent if the bylaws were silent, then yeah, a majority of the existing directors would be the quorum of the directors.
So are you saying if Deneen and I bump into each other at the grocery store and start talking about the collection of delinquent assessments, we'd be in violation?
Yeah, at that point, what we do is we call the HOA police, and
Yeah.
they come down there, and the first time they'll issue a citation. No, there are no HOA police, but yes, that's a violation. So basically, the statute says very clearly that the notice and open meeting requirements may not be circumvented by social circumstance or really any other means. And so, yeah, if you bump into Deneen at the grocery store, you shouldn't talk about association business.
Okay, Bruce, let me ask you another one. And I know all these directors, board members here aren't going to be happy about what I think the answer is going to be. But let's say back to our 3-person board. Let's say, can I just start emailing you and Deneen? Asking questions about who we should hire as a landscaper or who we should turn over to collections. In other words, does email violate the open meetings requirement?
The purpose and intent of the open meetings requirement is that owners have an opportunity to observe not only the vote that the directors take on a particular matter, but also the deliberation and the discussion amongst the directors. And the statute says that the open meeting requirements can't be circumvented by any other means. So yes, my interpretation is that if the quorum of directors are discussing association business by email, they are violating the open meetings requirements.
Okay. Now, lastly,
I make a distinction, and a lot of directors have this question. I make a distinction between, say, mere dissemination of information and deliberation on a particular topic that the board is going to vote on. So if, for example, we have a meeting coming up on Friday, you and me and Deneen are going to be there, and I email you guys the agenda and the board packet and just the information, and I just say, okay, we'll talk about this on Friday. I don't see that as a violation at all. But if I say we have this thing coming up on Friday and we have to decide whether or not we're going to fine Emma for her constant absences, and then you reply and you're like, you know what, I'm tired of Emma, and really we should find the maximum amount, then yeah, at that point, we're violating the open meeting.
Because that crosses the line into discussion and deliberation.
Right.
Okay. Now talk about the 2 exceptions.
The 2 exceptions, well, there's exceptions for executive sessions.
Yeah.
So the board is able to meet in a closed session for executive session for 4 purposes. Those would be to consult with legal counsel, to discuss collections matters, to discuss personnel matters, or to discuss the negotiation of contracts with third-party vendors. And those are the only 4 reasons. So you can meet in executive session, private executive session, to discuss those reasons. In order to do that, you have to first convene an open session, and then the chair is supposed to state that is in as much particularity as possible without revealing the issues that are going to be discussed in private, what the purpose of the executive session is, and that should be noted in the minutes. And the chair is also supposed to state under what circumstances or how soon the topics that are discussed in executive session will be able to be revealed to the membership. So you have to, but you can go into private session for executive session. You just have to follow the procedure. I suppose the other exception you're talking about is emergency meetings.
Yep.
And so emergency meetings you can do without notice. You know, I'm not sure that the statute really says that they could be not open. So let's just say that you called an emergency meeting and an owner happened to know about it and showed up. Could you exclude that owner?
Probably
I'm
not.
sure.
But then the question is always, what constitutes an emergency? I
Whatever I
think that,
say.
yeah, it's whatever
Yeah,
your guts now, but generally, if you need to convene and make a decision to prevent property damage or personal injury, it is most likely an emergency, and you could convene without providing notice. Would you agree with that, Bruce?
I think that's right.
Walk through procedurally real quick. You're in an open board meeting and I make a motion to discuss levying fines or collecting assessments against Emma, which is a topic for executive session. What is the process to move into executive session and then back out of it?
So what was the reason for going to executive session?
I want to discuss the collection of delinquent assessments with respect to a particular lot owner.
I see. Right. So first thing you have to do is notice and call the meetings. You have to notice the owners that we're having a meeting.
Let's assume this is just during a properly noticed board meeting.
Right. So at that point, at least one director should make a motion to move into executive session. It should be seconded. Theoretically, the board could then debate on whether or not to go into executive session. You vote to go into executive session. Chair would state the reasons as much particularity as possible for going to executive session. And then once you adjourn into executive session, you can kick everybody out.
Or sometimes it makes more sense for the board to go into another room.
Either way.
Depends on the logistics, but yeah.
You basically can close the meeting, and then you can discuss and deliberate. But what you can't do is take any votes. You can't take any action in executive session. So let's say we discuss Emma's delinquent account and we've decided what we're going to do is foreclose on her lot. We have to come out of executive session and vote to foreclose on her lot.
So we would come out of executive session, and then a director would make a motion to pursue foreclosure against Emma's lot, and same process, second, debate, vote, but the action must be taken back in the open meeting.
Correct.
Very well. That's open meetings in a nutshell, folks. Okay.
What happens, Kevin, if you violate it?
That's a great question. Let me just stop the recording here for a second. I'm just kidding. The consequences, here's what usually happens, right? An owner's upset about something the board has done or a decision they've made, and they talk to a lawyer and they're going to move forward with a lawsuit, and you've been violating the open, they're going to throw that in there as a claim. In other words, you have violated the statute that mandates that you have open meetings. Now, there is a possibility that if you violated it and a decision was made as a result, that decision could be invalidated. So there is a practical consequence in some situations. And I hate to say it, but are you going to go to jail if you probably not. But here's the reality, transparency is key. And generally boards that aren't following the open meetings requirement, they're not following a lot of other stuff as well. And that's usually a bad sign. So even if the consequences are slim or even minimal, still very, very bad idea to be violating any of the open meetings requirements. Now let's talk about quorum. Now, some of my colleagues make fun of the way I pronounce. How do I say it, Emma?
Quorum, like corn with an M.
Yeah, I often just say quorum. I don't know why. But quorum is the minimum number of folks required to be at a meeting in order for the meeting to be valid. And so every association is going to have two separate quorum requirements. The quorum requirement for an annual or special owners meeting, and then your quorum for your board meetings. And as Bruce said earlier, almost always your quorum for a board meeting is a majority of the board. So a 5-person board, your quorum's 3, 7-person board, your quorum is 5. Now for annual or special owner meetings, I've seen quorums all over the place. I've seen them as high as 50%. I have seen them as low as, and I'm not kidding, quorum is whoever shows up at the meeting. Have you seen that, Bruce? Didn't we just look at one the other day that said, so literally if one owner showed up at a meeting, they could make all sorts of decisions. But if that's what your governing documents say, that's what you go with.
You see that in some older documents. I
Yeah.
haven't seen anything that's like more recent than like 1980.
Yeah, so here's one where it's 10% is quorum. Whoops. Here's one for, again, this is the same governing documents. This is the quorum for meetings of the members, annual or special meeting is 10%. But then if you go to the further down, under the Board of Directors article, it's a majority of the number of directors. So
Okay, let me ask you some tricky questions, Kevin.
please.
Go back to that one about the directors there. So let's say you have a 5-person board under the bylaws, it calls for 5 directors, but you have currently only 3 volunteers serving and 2 vacancies. What's the quorum under this provision for those 3 directors to have a meeting?
That's a great question. To make a decision.
What's the quorum for the meeting? I mean, the quorum is
3,
just the number
still
of
3.
people that you need to be able to have a meeting, right?
Still 3.
Still 3, because it says that a majority of the number of directors. What if it said a majority of the existing directors?
Then arguably lower. Now, regardless if you're in Oregon or Washington, if you're a nonprofit and you have vacancies, there is authority for the existing directors to act to the extent necessary to fill those vacancies. But we've had situations where directors have resigned and the board cannot fill vacancies, no matter how much arm twisting that they do, no matter how much they try to get other owners to fill those, they just can't. And that occasionally happens. And then the question is, well, what if they can't vote? Bruce, do you see the question in the chat?
Yeah, so let's see. Jim asked if we have 7 people on our board. If I see another board member while I'm walking the street, can we discuss an HOA issue? Yeah, because your quorum, unless your bylaws say your quorum is 2 directors,
Which is unlikely.
possible, it's unlikely. Most likely your quorum, if you have 7 directors, is 4. So it's only an open meeting if you have 4 directors that convene and discuss association.
But Bruce, we get asked this question occasionally, and here it is. They'll say board members will say, well, you know, if a quorum is 3, what if I just send a bunch of emails and questions to one director, and then that director sends it to another director? If you try to get sort of what I would call cute with this and try to circumvent it, I think that's still problematic. The general rule of thumb, in my opinion, is any discussion or deliberation about HOA stuff should be in an open meeting. Short answer, but technically, Jim, yeah, that would not be a violation if it's just 2 of you bumped into each other. Let's talk for a second about proxies. First question. Can you use proxies at a board meeting? If you're a board member and you can't attend, can you give your proxy to another board member?
No,
Mary, that is absolutely right. You cannot. Oregon has a statute that says you can't do that. Washington case law suggests you can't do that. And the reason for that is owners voted for you as a director because of you, your qualifications. They trusted you. And so giving a proxy or assigning your authority as a board member, you can't do that. So proxies are something you should only ever see at an annual owner meeting or a special owner meeting. And there's different types of proxies. There's directed, which says, I, Kevin, can't attend the meeting. I hereby give Bruce the right to go on my behalf and vote yes on issue 1 and vote for John and Jane for directors. In other words, I'm directing him. I'm telling him how to vote. That's one way to do a proxy. Another way is just a general proxy, which would say, I, Kevin, can't attend the meeting. Bruce can go on my behalf and vote on any issue that arises during the meeting in any way Bruce sees fit. And you could also have a hybrid proxy where some things are directed, some are general. You can also have a proxy for the purpose of establishing quorum only. Now, here's a question. Let's say I give my proxy to Bruce, and Bruce shows up and he's checking in at the annual meeting, and all of a sudden I show up in person. What is the effect of my proxy that I gave to Bruce?
I think you have to leave.
yeah,
No, if I show up in person, Robert's rule says that proxy is revoked. So maybe I thought I couldn't attend the meeting a few weeks ago. That's why I gave Bruce my proxy. But if I show up in person, it automatically revokes my proxy. Now, one other thing, a lot of boards and even managers don't distinguish between a proxy and an absentee ballot. Those are very, very different things. And Robert's rules discourages absentee ballots. And what an absentee ballot is it's, here's everything we're going to vote on at the annual meeting. Go ahead and vote in advance if you can't make it. And the reason Robert's rules discourages that is that the whole point of a meeting is to influence people and change their minds through debate and deliberation. And so an absentee ballot does away with that. And oftentimes you might have a motion on an absentee ballot, but by the time it gets to the members for a vote at the actual meeting, maybe the nature of the motion has changed. And now all of a sudden that absentee ballot is of no use. Okay.
Kevin, you've got a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay. If a large document is being developed, does each draft need to be discussed in an open meeting? Most likely. It depends on what document it is. Let's say it's the board is going through to revise their bylaws. Do you need to discuss? Well, I guess the voting on submitting it to the members to a vote certainly needs to happen in an open meeting. But as a general rule, I would say, yes, if you're going to be discussing revised documents, especially if they're governing documents, do that in an open meeting.
Well, honestly, what I would usually recommend when you're doing something like that is to create a committee. And the committee would go through all those drafts. Committee meetings don't have to be open. It's a lot less cumbersome if a committee is handling that revision process and then brings that to the board. When the board looks at it, the board does have to deliberate in an open meeting.
Yeah, good. Someone asked, can the quorum requirement for a owner meeting be reduced under ORS 94? Yes, and under ORS 100. So if you're in Oregon, condo or HOA, your quorum can be reduced by half or 20%, whichever is greater. So say your quorum is a 50% quorum requirement, as long as your meeting notice says that you're going to do this reduced quorum, and I think we might have examples on our website of the language to put in there. Yeah, you can immediately adjourn it, recall it, and now here's some math. So it's again, half or 20%, whichever is greater. What is the reduced quorum for an association with a 50% quorum requirement?
75%.
Bruce, no, it's 25%, half or 20%, whichever is greater. So your reduced quorum would be 25. Now, what if your quorum is 15%? It can never go lower than that. So the reduced quorum only applies if your quorum requirement is more than 20%. Another one, can a member give a proxy to someone who is not an owner in the community? Yes, unless your bylaws restrict it. There's nothing preventing you from giving your proxy to your grandmother who lives in another state. You can give your proxy to anyone unless your bylaws say otherwise. Does a committee need to be made up of owners? Not necessarily. Generally, chairs and boards have very broad discretion on committee membership. And I've seen situations where there's been renters in a community that want to have some sort of participation. Fine, put them on a committee. I always recommend using committees. In fact, sometimes it's very effective if you've got an owner that complains over and over about a particular issue. Create a committee, make them the chairperson of that committee, and have them do research and make recommendations to the board. What if the committee is all directors? That's a problem. So if a committee has a quorum of the board, then every committee meeting is also a board meeting, and you have to give notice and let the owners be present.
So let's talk about this. So you and Deneen and I are on the board, and we're like, we need to draft a revision of our bylaws, but we don't have anyone else to volunteer. So Kevin, you and Deneen will be a committee to do that. Is that okay?
No, it is okay as long as we give notice 3 days in advance each time before we meet and let owners be present.
Why?
Because it's a quorum of the board.
Quorum, so
and we're discussing association business. Yeah. Great questions. Let's talk for a moment about voting. In board meetings, voting is often just done verbally. All in favor say aye, all opposed say nay, and that's fine. In larger associations with annual meetings, generally speaking, it's advisable to do written ballots, especially if there's a possibility that the vote or the procedure could be challenged, do a written ballot. But you could do a raise of hand votes. You can do a roll call vote. So someone has a roster of all owners and you literally read off the name of each owner and then record whether they voted yes or no. So use your discretion. I think there's at least a dozen methods of voting under Robert's rules. Ballots are generally the preferred method of tracking votes.
Is the voting method kind of relaxed when it's unanimous?
So yeah, one thing that is a very effective tool that a chairperson can use is unanimous consent. And so say at the beginning of a meeting, there's a whole, 3 motions in a row, all seemingly unobjectionable. There's nothing wrong with the chair saying on issue 1, 2, and 3, is there any objection? And if there is none, passes by unanimous consent. Meeting minutes.
How does that run up against the requirement under Oregon statutes to keep ballots for at least a year?
Well, if there are ballots used, then yes, you must keep those for a year. But I suppose if the vote was something that under the chair's discretion could have been easily done by a voice vote, nothing wrong with that. Just recorded in the meeting minutes.
Sorry, I didn't cut you off.
No, that's fine. By the way, Bruce is trying to stump me. I don't know if you've noticed this. And have you seen his success rate so far? 0. Every question he's thrown at me.
We're about to get good. What's gonna get you?
Sometimes they call me the Babe Ruth because I hit it out of the park.
You skipped my question in the chat box.
I missed it, but I am running. I want to get through. I'll let you grill me some more.
All right.
Meeting minutes, okay. I've seen meeting minutes that are 20 pages long. And you might think that I'm going to say that that's crazy, and I am to some degree. However, I will say this. In some circumstances, it might make sense to have very detailed minutes, but those circumstances are slim. In communities where a lot of the owners live off-site and their only way of knowing what's going on because they can't attend meetings is through the meeting minutes, fine. I've done work for an association for years, and for many of those years, they actually had a stenographer, a court reporter at their board meeting, and literally everything verbatim was taken down. I don't like that, and for a couple of reasons. Robert's rules discourages that. And I also think that if the whole idea, particularly of a board meeting, is for board members to speak freely, in my experience, people are less willing to speak freely if they know they're being recorded, or if they know that everything they're saying is verbatim. And that's why Robert's rules says really the only thing that needs to go in the meeting minutes is the motion and did it pass. Committee reports, attach them as an exhibit. Now, Oregon, if you're in Oregon, there's an additional statutory requirement that says the meeting minutes must state for a board meeting which directors voted yes and which directors voted no on each motion. Now, if it's unanimous, fine, just put unanimous, assuming that the directors present are stated at the top of the meeting minutes, that's perfectly fine. But really, Robert's rule says, give a little meeting details, the type of meeting, the date, time, location, and then really all that should go in there is the motion, who made it, who seconded it, and did it pass, and then the time of adjournment. This is on our website. This is just a sample, but type of meeting, date, location, those present, and then it's just really motions made if it was seconded. Points of order should be included in the meeting minutes as well, and then the big one, meeting adjournment time. That's meeting minutes, and again, meeting minutes, not hours.
But you don't have to note the time at which each motion is made.
You don't, but if it's a particularly long meeting, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, now everyone, if you thought this has been exciting, buckle up because things are about to get really fun. This is the new edition of RRO, Robert's Rules of Order, and it is the 12th edition, and it just came out last year. Now, Colonel Henry Robert, he was an officer in the United States Army during the Civil War. And after the war, you know where he ends up? Portland, Oregon. And he's a member of this church. And for whatever reason, Colonel Robert would stick around after church and just kind of sit in on committee meetings. Most of those were comprised of sweet older ladies. And he started to get frustrated because he'd sit in on these church meetings and nothing would get done. A lot of talk, but no action. And so over the next several years, he started to write down everything he remembered of parliamentary. He was from England originally. And so he starts to write down what he thinks are a good set of tools to run an effective meeting. And that's the origin of Robert's Rules. Now, the family still owns the copyright. So there's no knockoffs. It is still copyrighted. And it's by far the most popular form of parliamentary procedure in the United States. Now, for any of you Canadians, a lot of companies and associations in Canada use something called Sturgis's Rules of Order, which is actually much easier to read and understand. But in the United States, we use Robert's Rules of Order. And I tell people that really Robert's Rules boils down to 3 or 4 very simple concepts, which I'll talk about in just a second. And then people inevitably ask me, well, if it's that simple, why is this book 2 inches thick? Well, there's a lot of nuances, right? Like, you know, when debate or deliberation starts, Robert's Rule says you start with the maker of the motion, and then you rotate between those for the motion and those against the motion. And honestly, one of the best ways to learn this stuff is Robert's Rules for Dummies. And, you know, one of those yellow books. And I think it's valuable because it walks you through scenarios, real, you know, hypotheticals, and that's the best way to learn this kind of stuff. Now, one thing that a lot of boards don't know is that Robert's Rules has a special section for small boards. And so Robert's Rules is really designed to take control of large meetings where there's lots of people. And so in most situations for board meetings, you don't need that level of strictness or formality. Maybe you do. But I've been to a lot of board meetings that's in, you know, in someone's living room, and there's a few very nice owners and everyone's drinking tea. Do you need to go out of your way to enforce Robert's Rules and tell people that they're out of order? Probably not. But for small boards, which under Robert's Rules is 13 members or less, and most of you are going to fall into that category, it says motions don't need to be seconded. Informal discussion is fine without a motion pending. The chairperson doesn't need to stand when putting the question to a vote. So it does a lot away with a lot of the formalities. Now, all of these things that I just read you, terrible ideas if it's in an owner meeting or a large group, okay? But for small boards where things are civil, very well, go by Robert's Rules for small boards. Now, here are the basics, folks. And I'm very serious that 95% of Robert's Rules is simply this. Everything goes in this order: motion, second, debate, vote. Motion, second, debate, vote. Now, all a second does is ensures that at least one other member of the assembly wants to talk about that particular issue. And I've been in meetings where there's an owner that's trying to stir things up and they make motion after motion. At some point, they're not going to get a second. And if there's no second, the motion dies. Now, on our website, we also have a very good tool. You can print it off. It's 1 page, and it's sort of a cheat sheet for Robert's Rules. Because there are some exceptions to this whole motion, second, debate, vote. But in general, it's always this: motion, second, debate, vote. Now, in most owner meetings that I've been to, it's usually the opposite. A whole lot of debate about something that no one is really clear on, and then a motion. And that's a recipe for a really long, ineffective meeting. if you make sure that the debate is centered around a motion, that is a way for a quick, efficient meeting. Now we're going to walk through a hypothetical. So let's suppose all of us are members of the same association. I'm presiding, of course. I'm the parliamentarian and chairperson. Okay. And the meeting has kicked off. We've certified that quorum is there. We've already approved last year's annual meeting. And Bruce pipes up and says, I'd like to make a motion. Now that's fine, because there's no other motion pending. So Bruce has every right to make a main motion. Now,
I'd like to move to appoint a new chair.
out of order, Bruce. Actually, you could probably do that, but under this hypothetical, you cannot. So now let's say Deneen seconds it. That's fine. Now we have a second. Motion, second. Now we're in debate. So now we're debating. And we're going back and forth. Some of you are saying we don't need to spend $100. Some of you are saying we need to spend more. And then all of a sudden, Emma pipes up and says, I'd like to make a motion to amend. Now, if you want to know whether that's appropriate or not, you go to this chart and you see in the very bottom, main motion, that's the lowest form. So a motion to amend, if whatever Emma's motion is above a main motion, then she can make that. So a motion to amend is fine when a main motion is pending. So again, it's the same process. Emma makes a motion to spend $2,000 to renovate the clubhouse instead of $100, like Bruce had made the motion to do. Same process, motion, second, so it needs a second, fine. Now we debate, but keep in mind, we're debating only whether to make the motion to spend $2,000 versus $100, not to spend any money at all yet, just whether the motion should be to spend $2,000 or $100. So motion, it got a second, we debated or deliberated, and let's say it votes and it's approved. Now we're back to regular old debate. And now we're debating whether or not to spend $2,000 to renovate the clubhouse. Now let's say Ken, hi Ken, how you doing, buddy?
Hey.
How long have we known each other?
Not long enough.
I'd say a decade. I see Ken at Costco sometimes on the weekends. But let's say Ken makes a motion. He says, hey, I make a motion to table this because I'm hungry. Can Ken do that? I put this in here for fun. He cannot make that. Robert's rule says you can't make a motion to table just because you don't want to deal with it. Now, if Ken's motion was, I make a motion to table this so that we have time to form a committee to do some research to figure out if we need to spend $2,000. That's an appropriate reason to table. And if that was an appropriate motion to table, same thing, motion, second, debate, vote. Now, in this case, because Ken was clear that he's just tired and hungry and doesn't want to keep debating, as the chairperson and parliamentarian, I'd say, Ken, you're out of order. And then we'd be back to debate. Now, let's say we're back in the debate and Emma pipes up and says, point of order. Point of order stops the meeting, always. It doesn't matter what is pending. It doesn't matter what's being debated. A point of order stops and halts the meeting. And it's halted and stopped until the parliamentarian makes a decision as to whether the point of order has merit or not. And in this case, I'm going to say, Emma, your point of order is not in line with Robert's rules, and you have no authority to make that point of order. Therefore, I am denying that point of order. Okay, so I'm denying it. And then we're back to debate. Now, we're back in the debate, and now suppose Ken says in the middle of the debate, and again, we're still debating whether to spend $2,000 to renovate the clubhouse. Ken says, I'd like to make a motion to increase the reserves. Out of the blue. That's out of order because, again, go back to our chart. You can't have another main motion when there's already a main motion pending, okay? So I'd say, Ken, that's a wonderful motion. And maybe increasing reserves is something we absolutely need to talk about. But I'd say, Ken, we have a main motion pending. Therefore, your motion that you just made is out of order, okay? And then again, we're back.
Kevin, what would be a legitimate point of order?
Point of order, it could be that maybe Emma says way back when on this motion to amend, it didn't receive a second. And I skipped and went into debate. In other words, I failed you as a parliamentarian. That would be an appropriate point of order. Or if maybe I misunderstood your motion and it wasn't, you were tabling it because you're hungry, fine. Point of order, Ken was not making the motion because he was hungry. Ken was making the motion to table because he thinks we need to do more research. That's an appropriate point of order. Great question. So now, have you ever heard at a meeting where someone yells out, "I call the question"? I've heard it a lot. There's no such thing. I know what you mean, though. What you're really trying to say is I make a motion to end the debate. And the reason people call the question is because at that point, Robert's rule says the chairperson should put the question to the assembly. And so it's always a good idea as the chairperson to repeat the motion before the vote actually takes place, just to make sure everyone understands what the motion is. Now, same thing, that motion to end the debate, second, requires a second, and then we go to the vote and it passes. I announce the vote, that's fine. Now, let's say Ken makes this motion to increase reserves. Is that appropriate? That's perfectly fine, because the main motion we've been dealing with the whole meeting, it's been voted on, it's been approved, and there is no current main motion, and Ken's motion to change the reserves is perfectly fine. But let's say the moment after Ken makes the motion to increase reserves, before anyone could even make a second, Bruce stands up and says, "I make a motion to adjourn." Can he do that? Let's look at our chart. Well, I'll be darned. A motion to adjourn is the highest on this chart. And so the answer is yes. Bruce can make a motion to adjourn. In fact, Bruce could have made that motion to adjourn way back when, right after this first motion. And if it passes, the meeting ends. And no
I move to
business.
adjourn.
Well, hang on. And you know why? Robert's rule says if a majority of folks at a meeting don't want to be there, you shouldn't have to be. And so that's one where it actually, you don't debate it. It does require a second, but there's no debate. And if a majority of those there say, "Yep, let's adjourn," the meeting is done. Even if you're in the middle of a motion, even if you're in the just before voting on a motion, it doesn't matter. A motion to adjourn is one of the very highest motions you can make.
Kevin, we have a question. Is it correct for the member to say "I make a motion" or "I move"?
Either one. Robert's rules parlance would say I make a motion, but there's nothing wrong with saying I move that. Either one is fine. And again, there's nothing wrong with saying I call the question, assuming the chairperson knows that call the question is the same as a motion to end debate, fine. So yeah, as long as the chair understands what it is you're trying to accomplish, fine. Something got missed. There has to be a vote on the motion to end the debate. Calling the question does it? Yeah, that's correct. It does not end the debate. Might clarify.
Kevin, let's just say we've got a motion pending before the membership where debate is ongoing. You've got a lot of people who want to talk. Who gets to talk first?
So Robert's rules says whoever made the motion gets to go first, and then you rotate between individuals for the motion and against the motion.
Okay, and then if you're going back and forth between folks who are for and against, and then nobody else really wants to say anything else, what should the chair do?
I would put the question to a vote. Now, one thing that Paul,
so you don't have to have a motion to end debate.
You should, and this goes to Paul's question, which is, shouldn't there be a? So you could say I make a motion to end debate, but again, that a second debate vote. So if I make a motion to end the debate, but the bulk of folks there want to keep debating, you can override that and the debate continues. So here it's 2/3 vote. It does require a second. Actually, it's not debatable. but 2/3 vote requiring. So yes, saying call the question does not end things. It still requires vote and approval of the assembly. Can someone send me a link to the cheat sheet? Yes, it's on our website, Harker Lepore, but we'll send out a link. If you click on the resource button, it's got a whole bunch. It's got the sample meeting minutes. It's got this cheat sheet there. Does approval of annual meeting minutes have to wait for the following annual meeting? Not necessarily. It is possible you could have a special meeting in between the annual meetings, but the only group of individuals that can approve annual owner meeting minutes are the owners. So unless there's some other reason for the owners to convene through a special meeting, the only way to approve annual owner meeting minutes is at the next annual meeting.
Yeah, and there was a question that got skipped. Do approved meeting minutes need to be mailed to the owners? Can they just be posted on some website?
You could certainly post them. However, if an owner doesn't have access to email or the internet and requests a mailed version, my recommendation would be to send them a copy via mail.
Is there a requirement to distribute meeting minutes?
Not board meeting minutes, which is kind of crazy, but best practices, transparency, all of that absolutely make the approved board meeting minutes as available as possible to the ownership. Someone asked, oh,
I'm going to keep grilling you until you get something
yeah,
wrong.
please.
What's required to be on the agenda?
For which meeting?
Okay, let's start with a board meeting. What's required to be on the agenda for a board meeting?
Nothing. Just that
Does
they're
the
meeting.
agenda have to be sent out with the meeting notice?
Not unless not unless the bylaws require it, which it would be rare.
Okay, what has to be on the agenda for an annual meeting?
Almost always the bylaws will specify it's certification of the mailing of the notice, along with a certification that quorum has been met, old business, new business, and then election of directors. Most of the time, you're also going to be voting on that annual IRS ruling, which if you transfer funds, excess funds from operating into reserve, then you're not going to get taxed on it. So most of you do that as a routine motion at your annual meetings as well. So Bruce, to answer your question, usually the bylaws will spell out the agenda for the annual owner meetings.
So let's say you're at the annual owner meeting. The next item on the agenda is to discuss whether to expand the clubhouse. And chair says, okay, it gets to that topic on the agenda. What should the chair do?
Well, what's the motion? I would entertain a motion.
And so if nobody makes a motion, what happens?
It dies.
So you just move to the next agenda.
Yeah, so, and again, if you just follow motion, second, debate, vote, and again, what usually happens is debate and then motion, and that's backwards. So the best way to sort of focus everyone is make sure that the motion is made first.
Okay, let's say that the next topic on the agenda is to discuss the expansion of the pool house. But Deneen stands up and says, I move that we levy a special assessment.
Yeah, technically what Deneen is doing there is making a motion to amend the agenda. It requires a second, and then I need to check it's either a majority or 2/3. If they say, yes, we've just amended the agenda and we can do Deneen's topic now.
So if an owner makes a motion that's not on the agenda, but nobody approves to amend the agenda, the owner cannot make that motion.
Oh, they could still make the motion.
And it can't be moved to a debate.
That's right. Now, if they made it during the agenda item of new business, or even if it maybe fell under old business, that might be appropriate, but it's still going to require a second. And then Paul asked, during the debate, everyone should get a chance to speak once. Yep, when everyone that wants to has had a round, then people. Yeah, and so when I've chaired meetings, I usually, before we even get started, I lay out ground rules. And I always start it with this. I say, listen, everyone here. In fact, you know, one of the first times Bruce and I met years ago, he was managing a large association in Central Oregon. I was their legal counsel, and they asked me to chair this meeting. And I'd say, I don't know, Bruce, 300 people in a fire station showed up.
Approximately, yeah.
And not happy people.
No.
And so I just said, listen.
Anytime you get more than 10 people, there's some
things are going to go south. Yeah. So I said, listen, everyone that wants to talk, I gave them my word, you will get the opportunity to talk. And if everyone wants to stay there for hours, that's fine. But I just lay out the ground rules. And Paul, I usually do say, yes, we will rotate, people that haven't spoken have preference over those that have already spoken. That's also in accordance with Robert's rules. So yeah, the idea is, especially if you're chairing the meeting, to be fair. But again, at the end of the day, if people are sick of the meeting, if someone makes a motion to adjourn, it ends the meeting. And with that, we have 2 minutes for Q&A, a little less than I thought. I hope this is my favorite topic to talk about, by the way. I love meetings and Robert's rules. And again, I encourage you all, get a fresh copy, Robert's rules, 12th edition. There's also a whole bunch of publications by folks. Some of them are better than others. There's one guy, he's a lawyer out of South Carolina. His name is Jim Slaughter. And he's got a lot of sort of handbooks tailored to condo and HOAs and meetings. And his stuff is really, I've met him at law conferences. He's a wonderful guy. He's actually, I would say, I met him in New Orleans in 2003. And I think he is what made me just fascinated with meetings and how they're ran and the mechanics. I think it's a very fun topic. And I hope you learned a little. Emma, what's our topic next month? Do you happen to have that handy?
Yeah, let me check. It says it's a joint educational seminar with Colleen. Is that this next month?
We might change that up because Colleen just
Oh,
switched.
hold on. That was the week after. Insurance.
That's a buckle up. No, I'm just kidding. That's kind of a snoozer, but we try to make it entertaining. Anyway, thank you everyone for attending. I hope you're staying cool. It was kind of hot here in Portland today. Bruce is in Bend. What was it? What was the high temp in Bend today, Bruce?
Roughly 90.
Not bad, not bad. Well, once again, folks, appreciate it. We love doing these. We hope you learned something. And I hope we see you next month. Take care, everybody.